I want young journalists coming up to know that journalism is a very high calling, that if you are privileged to be called into, you should consider yourself blessed, and you should find space to be grateful to God for giving you the opportunity to be a journalist. I'm not sure why I qualify to lead a conversation about a national discourse. Because when I was very young, I was always being told to keep quiet. And when I was in Presec, my very good friend Daniel Chachu, he was sat next to me. So when Mr. Kote comes and there's noise in the class and he's looking for somebody to accuse of talking, my name will be on the list and I can't deny it, even if I didn't talk. Because nobody will be surprised that Bernard was talkative. So after years of asking me to keep quiet, I think I've gotten to a stage where people now say, you talk so much, we have to free you to talk. And I'm grateful that something I like doing has led to awards and recognition and salary. And it's a real blessing. I'll be taking sips of water so I don't get excited and enter the preaching mode. But I want to first acknowledge Citi FM and Citi TV for this great platform. I want to acknowledge Samuel Atamensa, the MD, and the management. I also want to acknowledge the Ghana Journalists Association, led by Avle, for the honor done me for endorsing this platform and for giving me that award to be Journalist of the Year. This evening, I'm going to try and provoke you to 3 paradoxes in Ghanaian society. Then we would discuss 5 shifts we must have to move the nation to its next level. And I'll end with a call for balance. I start with a longish quote, which I paraphrase. The paradox of our time in history is that we have taller buildings but shorter. We have wider roads but narrower viewpoints. We spend more but we have less. We buy more but we enjoy less. We have bigger houses but smaller families. More conveniences but less time. We have more degrees but less sense. More knowledge but less judgment. We have many more experts but even more problems. We have more medicine but less wellness. We have multiplied our possessions but we have reduced our values. We talk too much, we love too seldom, and hate too often. We've learned how to make a living, but we don't have a life. We've added years to life, but not life to years. We've been all the way to the moon and back, but we have trouble crossing the street to meet a new neighbor. We have conquered outer space, but not inner space. We've done larger things, but not better things. We've cleaned up the air, but polluted the soul. We've split the atom, but not our prejudice. These are days of fast foods and slow digestion. Taller men, but shorter character. Steeper profits, but shallower relationships. These are days of 2 incomes, but more divorce. Days of fancier houses, but broken homes. Days of quick trips, disposable diapers, throwaway morality, one-night stands, overweight bodies, pills to wake you up, pills to put you to bed, pills to make you happy, pills to keep you quiet. These are days of showrooms in windows, but no showcase lives. Paraphrasing George Carlin. This long introduction was to set our minds ready for 3 of the many paradoxes I see in Ghanaian society. Paradox 1, activity without productivity. Ghana's population is nearing 30 million. Our rebased GDP is about $50 billion. Singapore has a population of 5 million. That's a sixth of our population. Their GDP is $300 billion. That's 6 times our GDP. Despite the hustle and bustle at Kantamanto, at traffic lights, at Xiaomi Magazine, at Abotokai, despite all the kpakpakpa moves, we've grown to learn that motion doesn't equal progress, and activity cannot equate to impact or productivity. Ghana's population of 30 million depend on 2,300 megawatts of power. Israel, with less than 10 million citizens, has in excess of 12,000 megawatts. While today's talk is not about economy per se, it's an important corridor to pass through in understanding the paradox that Ghana has become. Our informal economy is bursting at the seams. Lots of trade, lots of exchange, lots of buying and selling. Yet collectively, the whole of Kumasi, which has about 2 million economically active people, has only 47,000 registered taxpayers. This is what the Deputy Finance Minister told me. It's not my own facts. As a country, we spend millions of dollars importing rice, tomato paste, cooking oil, and frozen chicken, including chofi. These are products importing. In 2016 alone, Ghana spent $555 million on vegetable product imports, $592 on foodstuffs of all kinds, $643 on plastics and wrap, and $544 on animal products, $516 million on textiles. Our economic raw materials, largely finished or value-added products, resulted in Ghana spending about a quarter of our GDP in 2016, a whopping $12.5 billion on imports alone, with a sizable chunk of the amount spent on things we can produce here. And as if this were not paradoxical enough, in 2011, we were noted as the world's fastest grower. Our 14% was a record. Yet, we are still waiting by that 14% GDP growth. In fact, my lecturer Boab Boateng did some calculations and showed that the employment elasticity of Ghana's economic growth in 2014 was below par. We are growing out of balance, but nobody is getting jobs from the growth. The economy suffers from growth without structural transformation. Our major exports are still raw: gold, crude oil, cocoa, timber. And already, our mineral sector has become an enclave sector with limited participation of local companies. So apart from the tax revenues we get, we can't form strong companies. We don't learn anything about how that sector works. We need to begin a new conversation about value addition. We need a new conversation on economic productivity. We need a new conversation about ownership and regaining the commanding heights of the Ghanaian economy. And the debate in Parliament will not be enough. Paradox 1 is over. Paradox 2, religion without morality. 70% of us go to church on Sunday. About 20-something% go to mosque on Friday. The rest believe in Odumankuma, Mausokbo Liza, Allah. As a Christian, I believe that one evidence of fear of God is impartation of life. For Christ said in John 10:10, I am come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. But our church and the Christian leadership in particular seem to have lost their way in being the conscience and guide of the nation. Because, paraphrasing Apostle Paul, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like unto corruptible man. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do things that are not fitting. Unquote. Our religious elite today seem to be imprisoned. The message of prosperity has taken over and eclipsed the message of sufficiency and simplicity. In our large churches, we are clapping hands and shooting the devil, while our minds are still enslaved by the chains of greed and selfishness. The gospel of Christ was meant to bring life and bring it in great abundance, but we live in a nation that has little regard for it. Deaths are reported as statistics, and the spate of loss of human life on our roads point to a nation which seems to have lost its grip on what the true value of life is. Money has been elevated over life, irrespective of how it is made, and there is no more truth in the land. Nobody questions the source of wealth, and our leaders, who ought to be the conscience of the nation, have become as guilty as the people they are meant to lead. 7 banks collapsed in the space of a year. Thousands of jobs lost. Millions of invested funds disappeared into thin air. As of now, we are still waiting for somebody to be brought to book. But this is the same society where people who steal dustbins get 3 years in prison, while those whose actions and inactions rob us of millions that could build hospitals, roads, and schools walk about in not just freedom but impunity. Over 2,000 lives perished on our roads in 2017, but for many, it's business as usual. A society that has no regard for life and does not cherish truth is what we are fast becoming. We had to wait for 193 to be knocked down on one of the major roads before the politicians got the impetus to rectify the situation. And even while doing that, they preferred to win the argument to say this wasn't their doing before solving the problem. 7 hospitals could not find space to treat a 72-year-old man whose family moved from one hospital to another from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., driving over 19 kilometers to get to a hospital whose doctors and nurses pray on Sundays and bow on Fridays. The no-bed syndrome became a mantra for health workers, most of whom are professing religious practitioners. But Isaiah said that these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, and in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. The paradox of the religious Ghanaian who has overturned the prescriptions and priorities of his faith and replaced them with the selfish personal ambition and greedy materialism deceitfully called prosperity. Woe to the Pharisees, for you pay tithes of the mint and the anise and the cumin, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. You have elevated the place of miracles, signs, and wonders, and neglected the weightier matters of law, justice, faith, and mercy. You have exalted the place of money and prosperity at the expense of morals and principles. You have idolized and deified our general overseers, and yet our members do not even appreciate the basic tenets of the faith they profess. We have built fanatical followers of church brands, but have failed in the role of growing disciples for Christ. We have elevated fancy suit-wearing, extravagant watch-clad prophetic preachers, jostling for space on our airwaves, and outdoing each other on primetime television. We have become fixated with a national cathedral when Christ has clearly said that God does not dwell in temples made with hands. And many Christians including some who are here, who know better, will keep silent because for them, church membership and correctness is now like the fanatical support of their favorite football club. But this is not too surprising, because this is the era of the foot soldier. Everyone is whipped in line immediately they disagree with the views held by the unrelenting mass of party fanatics, and woe betide you if you cross them on social media. You could even lose your job because you made a tweet that was not nice. And while these things go on, injustice and greed has created distraction for our young people. The same youth we are promising miracles are living in droves via the Sahara Desert, dying in Lampedusa, making a desperate bid back to Europe. A recent survey by Pew Research Center showed that 75% of Ghanaian respondents said they would prefer to live in another country if they had the means and opportunity to go. 75%. That's 3 out of every 4. This compares very unfavorably with 74% of Nigerians, 54% of Kenyans, and 46% of Senegalese who would take the chance. How did we get here? A society with the right focus will make this a matter of national conversation. But a society that has lost its values is what we have become. Making armchair jokes about defilement when teachers are having sexual affairs with their students. The stool meme became the plaything of people on Facebook, with people buying truckloads of stools because a teacher slept with a student in a classroom on a stool. Our modern day social media infused celebrity culture has produced half-baked superstars, many of whom are overexposed but underdeveloped. We seem to have forgotten the biblical injunction of true religion, simplicity, fear of God, faith, and love. Paradox number 3. Generally, the freer a media is, the more open a society becomes, and the more responsive the governments are. Ghana is globally recognized for its relatively free media space. And whereas that freedom is supposed to lead to more effective governance and better quality discourses, in the curious case of Ghana, this doesn't appear to be the case. As I've said elsewhere, to analyze the state of the media, we need to assess the role of 3 important factors. Policy, which defines the rules. Best practice, which tells us what's happening elsewhere. And private participation, who imagine what is possible by putting their money there. The Ghanaian media landscape today, therefore, is a combination of the efforts of government regulation through the NMC and the NCA, as well as the daring ideas of the Kofi Bedus, the Kofi Kumsins, the Kwesi Chums, the Nikamate Fields, and the Osei Kwame Despites. But effective media is not simply the existence of these institutions mentioned. It must have at its center competent, credible journalists who serve as the engine of a well-oiled machine. Journalists have 3 basic roles in society. We are gatekeepers. We decide what is important by setting the agenda. We are scorekeepers. We track what is being done by public officials, elected and unelected. We are also watchdogs. We set anas on judges and criminal sports administrators, and we get them sacked. But we need to ask ourselves, as gatekeepers, what kind of agenda we are setting collectively, and what we've done with the 26 years of Ghana's 4th Republic. Which stories have the media given prominence to? Which people have we dedicated our front pages to? And who occupies our morning show slots? Our scorekeeping role is no different. Performed creditably, it must measure the size and quality of politicians' accomplishments against the grandiose nature of their promises. It mustn't reduce the conversation of performance to simply a comparison of mediocre records. Our watchdog role must relentlessly expose wrongdoing and highlight the plight of the disadvantaged. I'm going to now talk about how Ghana's media has contributed to the evolution of our political culture and therefore our conversation. Our political leaders understood the importance of the media in shaping the national discourse. Kwame Nkrumah's Evening News worked coterminously with Kwabena Bone's agitation on the street. The 1948 riots did not just happen. It was a coordinated effort between civil society and media. In the coup d'etat years, the Achampong government understood the power of the media. Even though I wasn't born, I am told. He popularized the rediffusion box as a means of reaching the people. People would gather around the box, which was hung in the town square, and at 1 p.m., they would listen to the news broadcast. Then there was entertainment of all kinds, and Achampong did his propaganda. But Ghana's 4th Republican democracy has reached an interesting stage. After liberalizing the airwaves, we saw a rise in the number of private commercial radio entities. Joy FM, Radio Gold, Sunshine, Groove FM, Peace FM. These stations came at a time the nation had been starved of the freedom of political discourse. For many years prior to 1995, the only thing close to political programming was Talking Point. which where I lived was boring 1 hour before the real show, Akan Drama. The rise, because they introduced a format of political programming the citizens had been starved off under the Rawlings years. Radio Gold's Wednesday programs, Efson's File, BB Menson, The Verdict, Joy FM, Crossfire, Kakra Esamoa, Do Ajaho, Tony Edu, Kwame Nabatels, Malco Zomelo, the list goes on. Having opposing sides of a political argument and panel on a radio or TV show, although not entirely new, was such a refreshing addition to our newfound political life. The foundation, this foundation, became the template for the radio format that we practice today. But with 26 years of Fourth Republican democracy and over 400 radio stations, where is the democratic dividend promised? Where is the development and national shaping we hope for? Where is the coordinated agenda of ideas that media of this freedom should champion? Mathematicians, physicists, and business people gifted us a framework for analyzing relationships between things as they evolve over time. The S-curve shows 4 major stages of development of an organization, an entity, a country, an industry, or a civilization. It starts with introduction, rapid growth, plateau, after which you either decline or you grow incrementally. Our democratic experiment began and reached a very important zenith in the year 2000, where we changed government for the first time in years. It will be followed by the symbolic repealing of the criminal libel law by Kufuor, spawning many more media outlets, including the one I worked for Citi FM in 2004. In 2009, Ghana's democratic credentials had risen so much that President Obama had to ignore his native Kenya and come to Ghana, because for the first time, a country had changed government from one party to the other. This was the period of rapid replication and tremendous growth of media. But after 17 years of that experiment, it looks like our media and our politics has reached an interesting plateau, where now what used to send thrills down our ears sends chills down our spines. Because the plateau is where the pace of growth slows down and spirits begin to dampen. Our politics today is dominated by fighting talk and brinkmanship, occupying our airwaves. People whose main focus is how to capture power while in opposition, or how to retain it when in government. In attaining maturity, we are finding out that some of our national problems are structural in nature and require much deeper thinking and broad consensus. The skill most required in introduction stage is experimentation. The skill required in the growth stage is replication. But when you get to a maturity stage, the skill most necessary for any industry to survive is reinvention. We are at a stage where if the media doesn't reinvent itself, it will become obsolete. And if our democracy doesn't reinvent itself, it will soon begin to stink and annoy a lot of citizens who have been deprived of access to resources. Our democracy is also characterized by a constitution which has created a chief as a president. We are hamstrung because this chief of a president, I'm not referring to Nana Akufo-Addo, has to appoint over 6,000 individuals, many of whom he will never see or may never meet, including, interestingly, PROs of Ghana Gas Company. The constitution in itself and the manner successive governments have interpreted it has created a winner-takes-all situation, which heightens political tension and competition. The excessive powers of our presidency have created a situation where, even within the same party, people jostle to be closer to the pot of soup. And the popular expression for what this has led to is Edidija. Edidija is now the biggest canker in town, which drives our political elite in creating a do-or-die situation for us every 4 years. Because the biggest fear among the political elite is that once you lose power or your connection to same, people will didi and jar you. This situation has carried over into the floor of parliament and media studios and our media spaces. The debates in parliament are rarely about the future of the country or about solving the real problems we face. Politicians are more interested in who wins the argument to gain political advantage than in what needs to be done in the long-term interest of the people. When was the last time you heard an argument about how many of our children are being defiled in our communities in parliament? Or how many of our women die in childbirth needlessly because of bad roads? Or how the lack of jobs among the young people is leading to anger in the population? When was the last time you heard a meaningful conversation about the growing chaosification and containerization of our urban spaces, where people sleep in containers near the motorway, do number 2 in polythene bags, and cross vehicles driving 100 kilometers per hour to get to school? When was the last time you heard a conversation about that? Even with all these issues, our parliamentarians and politicians prefer discussing record comparisons. In one of today's headlines, a politician calls for a comparison of records on which administration had more presidential staffers. Let's debate it. Yesterday, it was about which government's doomsaw was worse. Who created more unemployment? Was it doomsaw or was it doomkra? Our political discourse is now focused on winning the argument and the election than in solving the problems that we face. And some have even created a forum for setting the record straight, which uses all the communication artillery at its disposal to fill the airwaves with all kinds of claims that don't really affect most ordinary people. These days, the most coveted position in our political parties is that of party communicator, with the added perk of a quick rise in the party and a possible deputy ministerial role if you bite hard enough and you punch high than your weight. 2 full years before an election, our airwaves are already saturated with talk of 2020. It's as if we live and die for elections. We empanel party communicators and spokespersons to analyze issues they have no relation or understanding of. They are discussing health insurance, education, road safety, and the media producers gleefully watch on as these noisemakers clog our airwaves with parochial election-aimed hot air. Why should Ghanaians be constantly focused on politicking when other important issues are crying for attention? What can we do to reverse this downhill slide of misplaced national priority, leading to an overfixation with politics to the detriment of everything else? If our democratic experiment is not to suffer a sudden blip and a catastrophic fall, we need to rethink our national conversation. I present 5 shifts in the national cycle we must have to reinvent our democracy and salvage society. Shift number 1, from electoral politics to development politics. Our electoral democracy has gone through an interesting phase. We must move to development. We have perfected the art of organizing foot soldiers, rallying delegates, preparing polling station executives, sensitizing serial callers. And we've done this at the behest of training the next generation to be value-driven, honest, and patriotic citizens. Countries, after they are ravaged by war, are urged to make a shift from bullets to ballots. But in Ghana's case, let's hold to the ballots, but let's shift from votes to visions. Let's evolve from winning the next election to securing the next generation. Let's move from comparison of empty records to a refinement of ideas. Let's transition from winning the argument on air to winning the fight against poverty, ignorance, and disease. Let's evolve from vigilante groups to becoming citizen vigilantes, from invisible forces to creating visible change, from Azoka boys to occupying the minds of Ghanaians. It's time for change. It's time for change. Politics in Ghana too often pretends to be a contest of ideas, when in actual fact and in essence, it's a parochial battle of interests. The private press has given a large platform to politicians. Enough. That era has served its term. We need to transition from political agenda session to national agenda framing. Our national conversation must take us back to a candid look at the Constitution as it is and boldly embrace the changes proposed in the now abandoned Constitution review process. But to lead this drive, the media itself needs to do another shift. The modern journalist needs a new set of skills to enable her perform the vital role of national agenda shaping. We must move from knowledge to insight. We have to better appreciate the role of citizens and duty bearers in the nation building project. We must begin to highlight the role and responsibilities of various state actors in delivering development. To do this effectively, let me remind you of 3 hard facts about journalism. Our obligation is to the truth as journalists, not to NDC, MPP, or CPP. Our obligation is to the truth. As journalists, our loyalty is to citizens, not business interests or political parties or religious groups. Journalism in its essence is a discipline of verification. We must develop a deep understanding of the subjects we cover, not just to report them intelligently, but to challenge the status quo. Economic journalists, of which I'm one, have to understand the flaws of the neoliberal economic worldview, which underpins the economic models we spoke about in chapter 1. We must evolve from news reporting to news analysis, to cause advocacy when necessary. In the words of Matt Winkler of Bloomberg News, journalists ought to understand the connections between economies, markets, companies, industries, and governments. They must not only understand, but appreciate the connections and relationships between these, which inform the basis of public opinion, if our listeners and our readers must not suffer the consequence of our ignorance, unquote. The third shift we must have is a shift from the coverage of news from a top-down to a bottom-up approach. We are in the cusp of an industrial revolution. Information is spreading and growing rapidly. We cannot afford to report he said, she said forever. We cannot afford to only quote those at the top. The people of Adenta, whose roads were killing them, needed a voice. There are lots more people in Ashaiman, Ablikumaman here, on the N1, whose shouts are asking for journalistic mics, who also need a seat at the table. If we don't highlight the problems they face and tell their stories to the world, the force of their frustration and the angst of their many years of neglect could spill into waves of protest which cannot contain. As storytellers, we must allow ordinary people to vent. We must consciously shift from top-down news to bottom-up reportage. Journalists should stop chasing politicians after press conferences for more sound bites. Go to ordinary people and ask them to share their views about the budget. The elected and unelected bureaucrats have had their say long enough. Let's go to the marketplaces, the lorry stations. Let's go to the farms. Let's go to the streets and the slums. Let's hear from the ordinary people. Enough of the pontification about structural rigidities and fiscal deficit and macroeconomic mambo jumbo. Let's go to the people and let's report the news. We must be comprehensive in our work, rigorous and unrelenting in our questioning, accurate and balanced in our reportage, cogent and convincing in our analysis, but we must be bottom-up in our focus. We must be honest enough to admit our mistakes, but we must also be diligent enough to correct them. End of third shift. The fourth shift we must have as a country is a collective shift from intentions to accomplishments. My production team on Friday, November 23, picked 3 newspapers and highlighted the top headlines in the papers. And with your permission, I will read the headlines. Friday, November 23, 2018. Ghanaian Times. SEC Ghana to benefit from Africa Regulator Program. Claude Nyako Adams. Ghanaian Times, November 23. Upper East to curb teenage pregnancy. Samuel Akapule. Daily Graphic. Ablikuma North Assembly to maximize revenues. Same Daily Graphic. Government to create 5 new assemblies. Daily Graphic, Emilia Enin Abe. Government to award contracts to vulnerable groups. That's a double 2 there. Adjoa Safo. Daily Graphic, same day, said Bukbe. Project to reduce impact of climate change lauded. New Weekend Crusading Guide. MPA to begin recirculation model pilot in Kumasi. On the same day, government to begin rearing for food and jobs in 2019. Go street business. Public sector reform to support private sector. Cocobot to supply weeding machines to farmers next year. Government to build 200,000 affordable homes for Ghanaians. Some are repeated every year and repackaged to the unsuspecting reader. If our national conversation has to change, it must now categorize news for what it is. Separate intentions from accomplishments. Transition from the future tense of empty declarations to the past perfect tense of concrete deliverables. We must move away from anecdotal evidence to accurate measurement. We are in a data-driven era. We must understand data and how numbers work. This era requires measurement of deadlines, timelines, quantities, values, and rates. Let's stop using anecdotal evidence to talk about unemployment. Measurement and precision must be at the heart of our national discourse. How many people are getting access to good health care? How long does it take the average citizen to get treatment at a hospital? How much time does one have to spend at a passport office to secure a passport? How long do we spend in traffic to get to work every day and back? What percentage of our waste do we recycle? How much nutrition does the average school-going child get? How many of our class 3 pupils can actually read and write? How long does an average asphalt road constructed at millions of Ghana cedis actually last? What is the average cost of a kilometer of road in Ghana? What does it cost to rent a chamber and hall in Kasua? How many people live in our slums? Where do they sleep? What do they eat? And how do they do number 2? These are numbers and quantities we must report, not nebulous speeches of politicians. Our national conversation must be driven by cold hard facts. Numbers, not sentiments, and not wishy-washy hot air. But in ending, I need to talk about balance. Because in making these transitions, one is tempted to be extreme in pointing only the negatives of society. We who sit at the heart of the media space have a responsibility. We are mirrors of society, showing people who they truly are. For journalism, is light and heat. Light to show people who they are, and heat to comfort the afflicted. Heat to also bear the chaff of waste and to chase those comfort. We need a new narrative in Ghana. Yes, we must highlight the problems, but we also need to show success stories. We must give a voice to the voiceless and walk the tight balancing act between reminding our leaders of the problems we face without failing to give hope to the many who listen and read us every day. This is an important balance we must strike if we are to drag this nation to its next level. The future of the country doesn't depend on hard news alone. We must encourage creative movie makers who tell us stories about our history. We must go back to our language and go back to the days of Akan drama, By the Fireside, and TV theater. We don't only need intellectual big news to shape a nation. We must also create concrete content that can bring smiles to people's faces. Because media at its best is about letting people know who they truly are. So this is also a call to the content creators of the TV stations to spend money and invest in culturally refined content. Let's go and take over the arts. We can't leave the arts for others and hope that in doing hard news you can shape a society. A lot of the national conversation in the markets is framed by Kunkum Bajia and what they watch on TV. If we are to take over the national conversation, we must go back to creative cultural content and repossess our colonized creative spaces. We have to go back to the values of hard work and exertion. For the heights of nations, reached and kept, were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while others slept, toiled their way through the night. To conclude, I want to give you a framework for national discourse and topics I think journalists must highlight in the days ahead. Too many people go to work in abject conditions. Our public transport has to change. We must insist on a working BRT, whether in this government or the next. The trotros we sit in are not worth human lives. It has to change. The places people stand to look for cars are not dignified enough. Circle and those places, by the time you get to work, you're already sweaty. We need a civilized public transport system, and the media must lead our agenda. We sank over $1 million in 16 hospitals. Not one of them is working. We must move the conversation from concrete buildings to how many human lives are being saved in our public institutions. We must go back to focus on the patient and preventive health in our health reportage. As for education, thanks to free SHS, is a major issue. But we should move away from whether free SHS or quality is what is needed to go into what content the children are getting. And how do we sustain the gains of the increase in the attendance we have in secondary schools? Our growing urbanization has its concomitant challenges. Expensive rent, lack of housing, growing crime, social vice. Let's stop just reporting promises of housing and actually come up with alternatives for housing our poor. As for sanitation and open defecation, I don't know where to start. We need to insist on a working recycling program. And every house needs a toilet. It's a national disgrace for 20% of the population to do open defecation. And on consistent rankings of sanitation, Ghana does abysmally. Our big suit and our big English notwithstanding. We must go back to basics. For every nation to develop, we must take care of our simple issue of disposal of waste. And how can I end without talking about the cancer of corruption? Petty or grand. People have to pay 10 cedis to get a TIN number. If you pay a bribe to earn the right to pay a tax, has the tax not already been collected? Enough of the corruption. We must start naming and shaming saboteurs who sit in public spaces and frustrate ordinary citizens. We must start exposing people who use their opportunity and position to victimize and to titillate. We must highlight the evils of corruption on various levels and expose and punish effectively people who walk about with impunity after having stolen our monies. We must remember that this nation was not given to us by people on a silver platter. They were men and women who sacrificed their life and their time to get us where we got to. Some were beaten, some died, some were shot, some had to lose their lives to bring us independence. It's now our turn to move the nation to the next level. We can't afford to fail the next generation. We can't afford to relax and be comfortable watching football matches and eating kebab and drinking beer while the next generation gets destroyed. It's time for the new generation of Ghanaians to arise. Arise from the ashes of complacency and move into the future of diligence. We must arise from laziness and hypocrisy and move into a future of hard work and humility. As Ifrimamu said in the great song that he sang, it says, Yenara yasasini eya bozindin mayen mojana na nanu hwegui nyadi to ho mayen. Or see, edru meni unsoso. It's now our turn to contribute our quota to this effort. The nation must not die in our hands. Let it not be said that in 2018 we lost it and lost the next 50 years. It says, Nimdien trasu tunon nkotunkrane cheating any apesemin kuminya selfishness are destroying our country and has maimed our character. And he makes a statement. He says, Omanu se beye ya na omanu se enye ya. The success or otherwise of the nation depends on the collective attitudes of the people. And so if we don't change our values as a people, the country is going nowhere. So the days of complacency are over. We should stop titillating ourselves and keep saying we are the first country sub-Sahara to be independent. Many countries have overtaken us and we are still wallowing in the argument of changing governments. We have to focus on the hard issues of development. These issues require time and patience. They require deliberate planning and they require humility. Ghana's elite must not fail the next generation. We can't be repeating the mistakes of the past and hope to have something different for our children. I want to urge you to rise up and insist on good citizenship, better leadership, and greater commitment to the national good. Let's rise up. God bless our homeland Ghana and make our nation great and strong, bold to defend forever the cause of freedom and of right. Fill our hearts with true humility. Make us cherish fearless honesty and help us to resist the oppressor's rule with all our will